Hi there, my name is Anna and welcome back to my art channel. So today you can see we are painting this cute little kitten, and for this painting I'm just going to be using black and white gouache paint. So I'm not going to use any of those colors you can see there on the left hand side. I'm just going to concentrate on black and white and really focus on getting my contrast right and just working on shapes and brush strokes and not worrying about color mixing at all. This can be a really nice exercise just to really focus on what's most important in a painting and take away the trouble of color mixing. I can't say I did this necessarily intentionally. I just chose this reference photo, which was already black and white, and I felt like painting it. And yeah, I'm not going to complain about not having to mix my colors all the time. So that was a lot of fun. And I probably wasn't any faster though than if I had used a whole load of colors, I must admit. You can see here I'm painting in my black background, and it's mostly black, and I'm mixing in a little bit of white as well, just to give it a bit of variation there. And as paintbrush, I'm using a relatively small synthetic paintbrush. I could use this one as well for watercolour painting. It's totally suitable for that, but it's not as soft as some of the watercolour paintbrushes I like to use, and it's also not as expensive because gouache paint can kind of damage your bristles a little bit, certainly more than watercolour could. And you do like to have a bit of a firmer brush also when you're using your gouache paints, because of course the paint has a bit more body. So you can see I've started to work on the body now, and I've blocked in some of the darker areas of the fur and also some of the grey areas. Because the paper of course is white, I can't start with my lightest highlights, and because I'm using gouache paint, which is opaque, I don't necessarily have to work from light to dark. So I can just jump around and paint whatever shade I feel like painting at the time. But yeah, I guess generally it's good to start with a mid-tone possibly. But here I started with dark first and added in some mid-tones then. But I'm going to go over this body very many times throughout this painting process. And the beauty about gouache paint is you can both layer your paint, but you can also blend your paint. Even if it has dried, you can reactivate it with some water or with some moist paint on top. So if any of the areas turned out too harsh, you can soften them later on in the painting process. The disadvantage, of course, can be if you're adding a ton of layers and you don't want to activate the layers underneath, then you have to be a bit careful, not use as much water, and just be careful while you're applying that paint to not move the paint underneath too much. Another thing to take into account when you're using gouache paint is that it can dry lighter or darker than it was when it's wet. That's just something to take into account, and you'll notice it as you're painting, and you can adjust by adding some more light or dark paint if needed. I've started to add some detail to the face. I've already painted in one of his little eyes, and I'm just taking my time and adding in those tiny little hairs on the face using a very fine brush. Sometimes it's easier just to indicate some of those little hairs and just indicate some texture without necessarily even painting in little individual brush strokes. That's what I did on the nose. Basically, I painted more or less flat area, but with some color gradation in there, so it looks a little bit textured, and I can add some fine hairs on top of that later. And on the body, you can see the hairs, the clumps of hairs are somewhat larger, and he's a bit fluffy and soft, so I'm not painting the individual hairs there necessarily either, but I'm painting these kind of clumps of hairs. And on the face, it's very important to make sure that the hairs go into the right direction, as you see on your reference photo, and that you kind of follow the pattern that the cat actually has. So it's somewhat recognizable to the reference photo. see, I just keep jumping around, painting areas as I see fit, as I feel like it. Sometimes you get a little bit bored working on just one area and then just move to a different area of the cat, or you just let your paint dry in the meantime if you need it to be dried, to do some layering there. You can see I'm reworking the body again, and as I add more and more paint, it becomes somewhat softer because I'm also blending the paint out a little bit in the process, and there's less grain of the paper showing. And I want that body to look really soft but also fluffy.
Well then, why?
Adding in some more highlights now because I had darkened it a little bit too much. And those white highlights obviously will show a lot better once you have some darker paint there underneath. What is most important for this painting, or for any painting really, is the contrast between light and dark. That's what will make your subject look really realistic. And because we're just really working in light and dark in this painting, it is super easy to focus on this here. Now I'm back to painting the face, and you can see on the bottom layers oftentimes I will use a fairly diluted version of the paint just to kind of tone the paper a little bit already and get an idea how dark I want that area of the paper to be. But for this painting in particular, I will be adding layers on top. I'll be adding hairs on top of those washes, and in end effect all of that paper will be nicely covered with gouache paint in the end. You can of course use thin washes throughout your painting process when you're using gouache, just as you would with watercolour. That definitely works as well, and then just add certain areas with thicker paint if you want to. And I did notice with this paint, if I used a decent amount of water, even if I had still a fairly thick mix, the paint would sometimes blend into each other as it would with watercolour, which doesn't necessarily always happen with gouache. But that did give me some nice effects, as you can see there in the background, for example. And the paint I am using in this case is the Windsor and Newton Designers gouache, and I really like this paint. It's only the second brand of gouache I've used, and I like gouache in general, but I do find that this paint reactivates a lot easier and it's just smoother in a way, I guess. Definitely my Arteza gouache was good as well, but this is just a bit more enjoyable to work with. You can see there's already a lot of detail on his face, and you can start to recognize the cat a little bit. I've added a lot of detail to the ear. On the left hand side you can really see the structure of the inside of the ear, and I just need to smooth out some areas a bit and cover the paper with some more paint, add some more details in the eyes now. For the eye, I was a bit concerned if I would get it looking realistic because it's just black and white, but you really need to get those different shades of grey and the black pupil in there and the really white highlight to really make it look watery and realistic. Adding some more highlights now with pure white on the body, and I'm going in with some darker paint again. And just touching up everything a little bit, refining everything. I think at the end you don't necessarily see all of those little tweaks necessarily, and they're not always very necessary, but just take it as far as you feel like it until you think your cat looks as it should. Now I'm adding some last white highlights to the face. Just using pure white here. And I'm starting to add some of the little hairs in the ears and on the face, and finally the whiskers, and then I have the piece completed, and I think he turned out really cute. Please let me know if you liked this little painting or not, and yeah, I hope you do. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and yeah, I'll see you again soon in one of my next videos. So take care and bye bye.